So I will talk about REACH and chemical regulation of very hazardous substances. And I start by telling you a bit about the importance of chemical regulation in the European context. I can tell you that in 2018, the European Environmental Agency came with this report where they put forward that 62% of the volume of the chemicals that are used currently in Europe were hazardous to human health. And then into 2021, the World Health Organization came with this report trying to quantify the burden of disease connected to chemicals, and then they came up with these figures that chemicals account for 2 million lives and 53 million disability adjusted life year loss. As a reference, environmental pollution takes 7 million lives per year, so of course this is less, but the amount of disability years is quite substantial, and you must think that many of the chemicals that we're discussing are used in industrial processes, so they are affecting the health of employees. And we also know that chemicals are not just affecting human health, but they are also affecting biodiversity. So when it comes to the estimates by the World Health Organization, I should point out that there are very, very few chemicals that are very well studied. I think there are some estimates that 5% of the chemicals that we have today in the market are well studied. And these are the chemicals that are the base for these estimates. So there are many, many chemicals we know nothing about, and they will not be counted in these figures. But as I said, chemicals also are affecting biodiversity, we know that, and then we rely on regulations such as REACH to protect the health of humans and the environment. So I don't know how much you know about REACH, but if we just start by the significance or registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction of chemical. That is what REACH stands for. And it's the regulation that is implemented in the European Union for regulating the use and the production of chemicals that can be causing problems. And this is one of many regulations in the European Union that are handling chemicals. There are specific regulations for pesticide, biocide, pharmaceuticals, and so forth. This one is one regulation concerning industrial chemicals. And when it comes to the meaning, registration was supposed to be some sort of change in the paradigm of how we regulate. Because from the moment when REACH was implemented, the idea was that firms that were using or they were producing chemicals that were potentially hazardous or any chemical, they should tell the European Chemical Agency about this. They should register the use or production of the chemicals if these happen to be more than a certain threshold. And they should fill in a dossier. And in this dossier, they should tell about the properties of the chemicals based on the literature available and so forth. And then the European Chemical Agency will take a share of these registration dossiers and will check, this is the evaluation side, whether or not these dossiers are complete and correctly fulfilled. There was a report and some scientific papers telling how firms had really failed to do this dossier reporting properly. This study looked into the dossiers and I wanted to see how many of these dossiers were properly completed, and there were very, very, very few. But then the last two parts, authorization and restriction of chemicals, are actually the actual regulations, we could call them. Authorization is mostly focused on substances of very, very high concern. I will explain what that is, and it's intended to control their use and production. And restriction is also concerned about chemicals that are very hazardous, but they don't need to be only in the production that takes place in Europe, but they also could be imported. So I mentioned that REACH addresses chemicals that are used for industrial uses. And I can tell you that by 2020, in February, there were 22,000, more than 22,000 chemicals that had been registered by REACH. This is a substantial amount of chemicals, as you can imagine. And I mean, REACH was an attempt of the European Union to homogenize chemical regulation in different countries that were very different, to set the floor even, and to be very progressive in a way. And REACH has been used as a model by many other countries, Malaysia, China, for example, Korea, have reformed the chemical regulation based on REACH. So now, when it comes to the substances I'm studying, these substances are very high concern. They are substances that are hazardous. They pose risk as carcinogenic, mutagenic, or they are toxic to reproduction. They might have persistent bioaccumulative and toxic effects, or very persistent and very bioaccumulative effects. So then, the authorization program, that will be the one I'm studying, is attempted to regulate these chemicals. And the process is in two steps. First, some of these chemicals are going to be put in a list that is called the candidate list, the CL. And when a chemical is added to this candidate list, that implies that the producer or the user of the chemical needs to inform all the supply chain that this chemical is present and the potential effect that this chemical might have. But then, it's also the second part, that some of these chemicals in this list will be put progressively in another list that is called the authorization list. That is actually the actual regulation, because it might imply that there is a restriction on the actual use or production of the chemical, as if it was some sort of ban. So the substances that are not that are in the authorization list cannot be made available in the market if there is not an authorization granted by the European Commission. And this authorization, it's difficult to get. It's at least costly, of course. Now there is an industry of consultants and so forth that can help companies to deal with the processes, but it's a process that requires time, and it's of course costly for the firms to get an authorization. So just that you get an idea, what products are we talking about? Like, because I mean, substances of very high concern. So here I just checked yesterday some example. Apple is disclosing the chemicals that are in their product. So you take the first one, 1,3 propanesulton, and that is a cancerogenic substance. There are studies showing that it causes leukemia and tumors in rats, and of course it's deemed to be carcinogenic. So you can check that. I mean, you are familiar with some of the products that contains them, right? iPhones, iPads, computers, and so forth. Many of them are today in this room, right? Then, of course, I mean, we have paintings, detergents, and so forth, many things that we are surrounded by. Then the idea that these substances will be disclosed, and then companies might have to inform the production chain, also might, of course, trigger reaction. This is taken from IKEA, where they are specifying to anyone that is like providing materials that CMR substances and CHBOs are not allowed to be used, right? So this is like a reaction, like more proactive. IKEA is very specific that anything in the supply chain needs to be rid of, or get rid of these substances. So of course, I mean, these are real things that happen to companies. They have to disclose. They might take action to react to these regulations. So one of the things I have been working on during the last year is about the regulatory process. I am an environmental economist. I want to understand regulations, and I have been very fascinated by some of the features of these programs, but the authorization program again, but the one that is dealing with the industrial chemicals that are produced or used in the European Union. And interesting features of the process are that for having a chemical listed in the candidate list, that is this first step towards a potential regulation, it's the countries themselves that have to propose what to regulate. And then, when they have done it, then the collective of countries must agree on these suggestions. I can tell you that the process to get substances to the candidate list has been slow. I mean, there was some point where the European Commission identified 1,500 substances as potential substances of very high concern. We have not yet been able to suggest 1/3 of those substances to the candidate list. So it has been a slow process, and actually at some point the European Chemical Agency had to jump in, also start proposing, because it was just going too slow. And the second part has to do when something is in the candidate list, then to be moved to the authorization list, there will be also another political process. Because first, the substance needs to be suggested by the European Chemical Agency, ECHA, taken up from this candidate list, proposed, and then there will be public consultation, allowing stakeholders at large to comment on this before the European Commission actually takes a decision on whether or not to add this substance to the authorization list, which will require companies to get authorization. So then this kind of puts question, okay, but there are many incentives one can anticipate already there. So the question is like, okay, given that these are the processes, what type of substances are we actually regulating? And then I had written a paper about it. You can find it in Nature Communications, where I collaborated with natural scientists and a professor of mathematics to try to really answer this question in the best way we could. What we did is really trying to understand. We thought, okay, what can matter for regulation? Certainly toxicity. It should matter that the chemicals are very hazardous, so then let us try to approach that aspect of the chemicals in the best way we can. Economic aspect should matter. Let us account for that as well. And then knowledge should matter, because of course it's easier to regulate chemicals we know something about. So we try to proxy for these three aspects. And then when we have done that, then we try to understand, okay, but which of them is most important for regulation? And then what we found is that the most important single indicator on what something is being or not added to the candidate list was whether or not this chemical was being used or produced in the European Economic Area, right? So which for us was an indication that maybe we are not really focusing on the right chemicals. Certainly we might be focusing on chemicals of secondary importance, because I mean we would have expected that the hazards were the most important factor. So if I go more in the detail, so this work required a lot of time just to be able to create these proxies for these aspects, toxicological properties that will account for cancerogenicity, mutagenicity, reproductive toxicity, and even the environmental effects of these chemicals, trying to collect the information that was available and so forth. And then also to get information about the economic aspect that we proxied by tonnage, the number of countries that had ongoing or previous production or import of the chemicals, and even we collected all the scientific literature in relevant journals, and we counted through machine learning how many chemicals were, or how often the chemicals that were suggested were named these publications. So we were able to develop this index of how much we knew about the chemicals. Yeah, regardless of that, we ran regressions. We used different samples. We took the whole universe of the chemicals in REACH and compared their properties to the properties of the chemical being listed. We took other lists of chemicals that were more targeted toward very hazardous chemicals, and the answer was the same. the most important factor explaining where a substance is listed was where or not it's being produced or imported into the European economic area, and the same actually holds for the authorization list. Among the CMR properties, we found that toxicity to the production seemed to be very important, which goes aligned with different type of directives that have attempted to regulate such risk in Europe, followed by cancerogenicity and chronic aquatic toxicity. And then something important to mention is that our analysis wasn't able to establish causality in the way economists usually does, right? We did not do that because of the design of the study, but we found a very strong correlation between production or the lack of production and the listing of the chemicals in the candidate list, which really poses a question, but why? Why we are doing this? Why we are regulating chemicals that are not being produced or imported in the European Economic Area? So then we had kind of two ideas here. One can be just simply because of the process. It's just, countries need to suggest things that are going to be voted. Why not to go for long-hanging fruits? Chemicals that are hazardous, we know them to be hazardous because the chemicals in the candidate list are hazardous. That's not a question. But these are not going to affect the interests of many countries. That was a potential explanation. And the second one was that, maybe there are some European countries that really want to prevent these substances to be used as potential replacements of substances in the candidate list, so sort of like a regrettable substitution argument to include them. But then if that would have been the case, we still kind of puzzled because that would totally change the focus of the regulation. This is one of the very few regulations that actually can reduce the use of substances, right? So why to go from a reactive stance to a proactive stance? So then what would ensure that the substances that are very hazardous will be actually regulated, if that is the case? So, so then I have kept going with this research, trying to understand more in detail the type of incentives that are created by this regulatory process. So actually, I have an ongoing project where I have been modeling the economic decisions that is behind here. So we have a collective of countries where individual countries have to suggest substances, and the collective will have to vote. And then when I think about this problem, I have contextualized it in the sense that we have consumers in a given country that are using these chemicals, and these chemicals might be the different type. For example, say that we have a very hazardous chemical that is produced by a company on the country or by a company somewhere else, and there is an alternative chemical that can be used instead that is not hazardous. What would be the gain for a country to submit a dossier? Would there be a gain? Or what type of countries will submit dossiers? This is kind of the type of question I have been thinking about. And particularly because the regulation has these two properties, right? First, it's a disclosure mechanism. It discloses information that certainly in the context of differentiation might increase differentiation between products. You suddenly had this paint, now you have and you had this one, and you are kind of informed that this is very hazardous. So this one becomes so much better, right? And on top of that, this one might be banned. So this oil product might have a lot to gain. So those kind of considerations might imply that, of course, there are winners and losers in the industry connected to these regulations. So what can we anticipate from that for the type of profile of countries that are going to be submitting proposals? And I'm not going to go through the model, but I can just tell you like the three kind of key hypotheses that come from that. And then it's evident that countries are more likely to suggest chemicals that they're not producing nationally, because of course they will not have the losses of the industry. They might have, of course, a reduction in the consumer surplus, but they don't have the losses of the industry. And on top of that, of course, I mean, there will be a reduction in risk if these chemicals are very hazardous. If it happens that a country that produces a chemical is suggesting that chemical for regulation, then that should be a clear indication that that chemical must be very hazardous, because otherwise there is no gain. If there is going to be a potential losses for the industry, then for being a gain, there must be that that chemical is very, very hazardous. And the third hypothesis is that, well, given the rules for the voting and the fact that countries in general will prefer not to regulate things that are produced nationally, we will have that it will be easier to agree on chemicals that are not used or produced by the countries in the federation. So here I can show you a table. It's a lot of calls. Let me explain them in detail, where I'm summarizing the information that comes from the register of intention. This is like the information of chemicals that have been suggested by for regulation by countries and by the agency. And here I mean the European Chemical Agency, ECHA. And then in the last part, you have differences when the stars are reporting whether or not the differences are significant. And then I can tell you already there that in the first row, you have the number of chemicals that have been suggested by countries. 379 chemicals have been suggested by countries and 63 by the Chemical Agency. And out of those 379 chemicals suggested by countries, we can see that 289 have been suggested by chemicals that are not using the chemical domestically, right? So that's already kind of confirmation of the first point, that we see that it's going to be more likely that countries that are not producing or using the chemical domestically will be the ones proposing chemicals. And then we also see differences in terms of the share of these chemicals that are not even used or produced in the European Economic Area, depending on who is submitting. We see that ECHA is submitting chemicals that are of relevance for Europe compared to countries. And we also see the number of operating countries that are using the substances that have been proposed, and we see that the countries that are actually using or producing the chemical domestically tend to submit a proposal for chemicals that have been more used and have more registrants. And then we see information about the toxic properties of the chemicals. The CMR score is a score that goes between 0 and 1, where 1 will mean that it's very, very hazardous. And then we divide in the categories. And here the idea was that if a proposal comes from a country that is that is using or producing the chemical domestically, then the chemical must be more hazardous. And I actually do find evidence of that, because countries that are submitting proposals for chemicals that are produced or used domestically are more hazardous. This can be seen particularly in the cancerogenic properties, where there is a difference between the two types of countries. So then I can move forward. I can tell you how, how this the sequence of regulation from candidate list to authorization list also goes. I told you that from the candidate list, the European Chemical Agency will pick some chemicals to be considered for inclusion in the authorization list. And this is shown in the second call in the table, RP. These are the chemicals that the European Chemical Agency has taken from the total chemicals proposed to the candidate list for potential inclusion. And you already there also see differences between these chemicals in terms of how much they are affecting firms in practice, right? Comparatively, there is a much smaller share of those chemicals submitted by ECHA that are not being used or produced. They have more operating countries that are registered more often. But what is interesting is that what ends at the very end, in the after the authorization list, is very similar to what countries have proposed from the very beginning. So in a way, this tells us the authorization list mimics very much kind of the feature of the substance that R&D candidate list. I would say that's the message. Yeah. And as I told you, and the process through which things end up in the candidate, well, in the authorization list is involving public consultation. Public consultation has become very used in Europe. It's a way for agencies to collect information from different stakeholders. And I mean, in principle, this makes sense. These are decision makers that don't have perfect information and they go to stakeholders to get more information. The problem is that these stakeholders, of course, are biased in the first place and that the participation is not equal. It's very clear that, industry tends to participate much more than NGOs or academia in this type of public consultation. They have more closer connections, or preferential access, and also we see in the empirical evidence that the chemicals that are countries that are producing chemicals also have better representation. So here I can show you, connected to the chemicals that I show you, there are the public consultation, both to the candidate list and to the authorization list, where these stakeholders were able to submit their opinions on whether or not the chemical should be regulated. And you see that we identified 3 types of actors, firms and industry, competent authorities and national organizations, and the third is NGOs and others. Some academia. Academia actually doesn't tend to participate that much. And you can see interesting pattern. First is just that, of course, I mean, in terms of the number of actors, firms are much more active, and even more in the second stage that actually implies a potential ban, right, that has actual consequences. Support by industry goes very much down. In some cases, they can support inclusion on the candidate list, but then the support for the ban, it's much reduced. 0.87% of all their comments somehow are supporting regulation, compared to NGOs and competent authorities that are much more supportive, but of course they are also providing much less comments. So in the plot here, I'm not sure it's so easy to see, but you have 3 categories. First, in the left panel, you have the relative support by firms for inclusion in the authorization, and you have 2 cases, the cases of the chemicals that did not end up in the authorization list versus the chemicals that did end up in the authorization list. And then in the middle, you will have the support by national authorities, and in the third one, you will have the support by NGOs and environmental organizations. So from the last panel, what is very clear is, of course, I mean, NGOs tend to support all the time, and they don't seem at all. From the plot, it's very, very, very unclear that they have any pivotal effect on the actual decision to authorize. And this we verify empirically. They provide comments. The comment will be always the same, and it will be more or less regulate, but they will have very little impact in the actual decision. The national authorities have a more diverse or more heterogeneous profile, and they might, their support might actually end up having an impact in the actual regulation. While firms, I mean, they are much in the bottom because they are really supporting, but when they do support, they seem pivotal in the decision to regulate. And that is confirmed empirically. We can see that if some companies support regulation, then regulation, it's more likely to be passed. So if I conclude from this part, I can tell that my research has shown that national economic interests have affected the decision to submit a dossier and what to be proposed for inclusion in the candidate list. The data reveals that there is a large share of these substances that are being included in the candidate list that are actually not being currently used or produced in the European Economic Area, and that countries do not tend to suggest chemicals that they are using or producing domestically, possibly because they want to reduce opposition. And then, yeah, my research has shown that this may very much be a result of the incentive structure that is behind this two-stage collective choice process. And then there might be a risk that actually we are not regulating to ensure a timely protection of human health and environment. So how I'm doing with time? How much time I have left? Okay, then I can just tell you that at the same time I have been that research. Nope. Yeah, I also have been looking into the effect of this candidate list in Sweden. So I have collected information. Sweden and the Nordic countries are one of the few countries where it's possible to keep track of the use of chemicals in products. And I have been trying to identify whether or not these lists have an effect. And I have shown that actually it does. That inclusion on the authorization list particularly really have a significant effect in terms of the reduction of the use of the chemicals, which is a pity because the instrument might work if well employed. But unfortunately, yeah, if we are regulating half things that are not relevant, then of course the space for regulation to make a difference is very limited. So I think I can stop here and take more questions. Yeah, I want to. Yeah, but I don't think it matters now because it's just 5 minutes. So I think maybe I can take more questions if there's any.
Okay, thank you very much. You have to stay with the microphone.
Okay, yes.
So, are there any questions for the audience? I would say that I find very interesting the way you show that national interests are taken very seriously by countries and are the main explanation of the incorporation of some substances on the authorization list. But would you say, from your research, are you able to say that some very hazardous substances that could be regulated are not because of the process? Do you have some examples? Or
yeah. So well, yes. I mean, we do find that there are substances that could be regulated that are at least as hazardous as those that are regulated that are not being regulated, right? So then we have had discussions with the relevant authorities about that. Why to choose to regulate things that are not being used or produced, but we haven't come too long in trying to find a clear answer. I will also say that this about the collective choice, of course, it's something that I am studying in the context of chemicals, but it applies to many other domains. And I think biodiversity protection would be one of them, right? Because it's this principle of subsidiarity that the European Union has taken. So the countries are the first to choose, and then there's some sort of agreement. But for example, when it comes to the protection of biodiversity through the Natura areas, for example, then it's also clear. I mean, countries choose to protect areas that basically maybe didn't need protection because they are located in such a place that they will barely see in use, but then they are the ones that are protected because they don't cause economic cost to anyone, right? And I think that's a relevant aspect. I think this subsidiarity kind of feature, it's of course leading to outcomes and not necessarily consistent with the protection of neither human health or the environment.
Yes, and something that may happen also is that a first lobbying step occurred at the national level. With firms lobbying the national governments in order to obtain that different member states take positions in accordance with their interest. Some other questions? No? Everybody is tired after this morning of presentation.